to another episode of Outside the Beltway, where we get perspectives from outside the Capital Beltway on important issues. And today we're joined by Graeme Smith, who is a senior consultant for the International Crisis Group. And Graeme, how many years have you spent in Afghanistan back and forth? Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your connection to Afghanistan?
I first arrived in 2005 when I was the Moscow bureau chief for a Canadian newspaper called the Globe and Mail. And then I stuck around. I was there for about a decade on the ground, on and off through the years. I was a newspaper journalist, a book author, a documentary maker, then a think tank guy. I joined the International Crisis Group for the first time in 2012. I did a short stint, a few years on the domestic politics desk of the United Nations mission there, doing political analysis. And now I'm back with the International Crisis Group, trying to keep an eye on the situation and rebuild our operations there.
And you spent a long time looking at the U.S.-led war in Afghanistan, and now you're looking at the economic collapse of the country. A collapse that the IMF predicts is going to produce a 30% contraction in the economy. We're looking at inflation rates of 32% currently. We're dealing with a country that has drought in 25 out of the 34 provinces. And it's a country that had close to 50% poverty rates before the collapse of the last government, and 7.3 million people facing food insecurity when the year began. And now, of course, the collapse of the previous government and the Taliban takeover of the country and the flight of the donor countries has produced an even more acute economic crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's been a real spiral downwards for the Afghan economy. It has sparked the world's greatest humanitarian disaster with tens of millions of people on the brink of starvation. Those numbers that you cited those are the official numbers. But to be honest with you, I'm in touch with the people who put those stats together, and it's a bit of a finger in the wind. We don't really have our arms around how bad it's getting out there. The best estimates are from the IPC, the folks who do the measurements of starvation levels. Right now, you have something in the order of 23 million people in either IPC 3 or IPC 4. Those are kind of getting towards famine. We don't currently have anyone in IPC 5, like a full-out famine, but I'm really afraid that we are tipping in that direction, that as we get into 2022, you're going to start to see headlines about a full-on sort of medieval-style famine in Afghanistan. And it's going to be just heartbreaking.
And of course, the Taliban have not managed the economy with incredible effectiveness, but they've been handed a pretty bad deck of cards, and they certainly haven't taken the steps that they could have taken to make it more politically tenable for donor countries to engage with them. But you still argue that the biggest culprit are the donor countries cutting off the emergency aid and the freezing of the central bank reserves. Why is that?
I mean, admittedly, in a sort of fast-moving situation like this, it is hard to pick apart the causality. So, yeah, as you say, I mean, there's an ongoing drought. We occasionally have droughts in Afghanistan. This is one of those years. There was already a crisis of quite large proportions going on before the Taliban takeover. And then there's the question of Taliban management. I mean, could the Taliban be making better moves, appointing more sort of technocrats, for example, to the central bank or the Ministry of Finance? Possibly. But really, as you said off the top, the Taliban have been handed a bad deck of cards. I mean, when we talk to economists about the choices that they've made so far, there are very few choices available to the Taliban to mitigate this crisis in a meaningful way, while the West continues to impose sanctions, continues to freeze the assets of the central bank, continues to deny the central bank access to the global financial system. it's a whole range of economic restrictions that are still imposed upon the Taliban and upon the government more generally by the West. And this is driving really a plunge into very serious poverty. I mean, the United Nations has started to use the phrase universal poverty. That is to say, like, almost the entire population could be impoverished this year.
And so one of the ways the Taliban tried to manage this crisis was by enacting banking restrictions. So you could only take out so much money from the banks, and even with those limits, oftentimes the money ran out anyway. And this retained some of the value of the Afghani, or the currency of Afghanistan, but of course it completely crippled the financial sector. Is my interpretation of that correct?
It is correct, and it's not a wonky point. I mean, the reason why we're talking about the value of the Afghani or the availability of U.S. dollars in terms of cash liquidity in the currency markets. I mean, you have like the United Nations Secretary General talking about the liquidity crisis in a poor country on the other side of the planet. It's not an ordinary thing, but the reason why we're all talking about these kind of nerdy financial topics in Afghanistan is because Afghanistan is a heavily import dependent country. The calories required to keep the population alive, tens of millions of people, that depends on imports. And in order to make those import deals, traders require US dollar liquidity. So the central bank was going in a few times a week into the currency markets and trading large amounts of US cash for Afghani cash. And that was supporting the value of the Afghani. It was also allowing these traders to make US dollar denominated deals to bring truckloads of food into the country. And so now you see Western sanctions crippling the financial sector, and there's just no replacing that mechanism. There's no food trucking operation in the world that can bring enough bags of food into Afghanistan to replace the sort of regular economic functions.
So we have a country that literally can't produce enough food to feed its population, that's dependent on imports, not only for food, but also for its manufacturing, whatever other sectors it has. And we had these currency auctions that have come to a grinding halt. And of course, we had these sanctions, these pre-existing sanctions on the Taliban as a terrorist organization and an insurgent group that have essentially de facto become sanctions on the government of Afghanistan, since that group has become the de facto government of Afghanistan. And I mean, doesn't that go way beyond the original intent of these sanctions? They were never intended to sanction the entire country. They were intended to sanction the Taliban as an insurgency. But now what's happened is they've essentially sanctioned the people of Afghanistan.
That's correct. Yeah, it's the strangest thing, In fairness to U.S. officials and other international officials who've been dealing with this situation, this has never happened before. That sort of listed terrorists take over an entire country, and so they've had to kind of tear up the rule book. Nobody knows what happens next. And so far, what U.S. officials and other officials have decided will happen next is that they have created exemptions for the delivery of humanitarian aid. So they've made it basically legal to send in, shipments of food, shipments of medicine, but the implication of that is that it's essentially illegal to do other kinds of activity. And so when I talk to friends who are, business executives in Afghanistan, they say the banks won't deal with us. International banks have decided that we're untouchable. Right? They can't get suppliers to send anything to Afghanistan for their businesses. And so the effect on the ground of the sanctions is that it worsens the humanitarian situation quite dramatically. Even at the same time as international donors are ramping up a multi-billion-dollar aid operation. So it's really it's sort of a self-defeating policy right now from the West.
Yeah, and so the Biden administration has promised a lot of aid since the summer. I think it's over $750 million, and they've issued those general licenses, which are essentially exemptions to certain U.S. sanctions. Um, what are the steps that you think the U.S. government and international community has gotten right since August, and what really needs to be done?
Well, it's absolutely right that Treasury and the UN Security Council have both put out exemptions that allow for the delivery of humanitarian aid. That's a positive step. Um, Aid agencies tell me that they are getting around now on the ground in Afghanistan in a way that they couldn't before, because you had the world's worst war that was tearing up Afghanistan, tens of thousands of people being killed every single year, hundreds of thousands displaced. And now there's effectively peace across most of the territory. And so aid agencies are getting in there in a way that they simply couldn't before. Um, but there's still such a long ways to travel. The really generous donations from the international community, and you've highlighted the contributions of the United States, but other donors, particularly European donors, are really swinging into action now because they fear mass migration from Afghanistan into Europe. Those really huge amounts of money that are starting to be geared up on the humanitarian side. And we're talking, this is going to be the largest humanitarian effort in the world, probably. The funding request from the United Nations for $8 billion in the coming year is, I believe, the most expensive document in the history of the United Nations of its kind. Those really generous donations could be wasted if, at the same time, Western policy makes the situation worse.
So the Taliban often boast about how Afghanistan is now safe, the roads are safe. Of course, this is a bit ironic because they're safe from the Taliban's own IEDs and attacks on convoys, et cetera, that used to exist and kill a substantial amount of civilians. But it does present an opportunity for aid distribution, as you've pointed out. But you also say, look, this is the most substantial humanitarian effort that has ever occurred. And I can't help but wonder, how sustainable is that? And are we falling back into a trap where we make Afghanistan even more aid dependent, and we create we transition from a fictional war economy that's unsustainable or inorganic war economy to one that's totally dependent on humanitarian aid? And it might not be a war economy, but it's equally or even more unsustainable.
It's funny. The Taliban aren't notable for being development economists. It's not really their thing. But that is actually the point that they have been making in some of these meetings is, look, don't create expensive parallel systems that aren't sustainable. Instead, you should be buttressing the existing Afghan state, which, the Taliban make the point. They say, look, there were 500,000 Afghans already working for the government before we took it over. And the Taliban will say, we only appointed an extra 4,000 or so people. So really what you're talking about is a substantively kind of pre-takeover structure that could still function, could still deliver services. And it's not being allowed to in many parts of the government. And so, yes, absolutely. There's a real risk of getting into a sort of a Gaza-like situation where the international community tries to create parallel systems that create a sort of a permanent system of aid dependency, unfortunately.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room for a moment, which is these frozen central bank reserves. And I think it presents a political problem for the Biden administration and for donor countries overall, because you don't want to be viewed as handing pallets of cash to the Taliban. And the Biden administration faces another political problem, which is that there's ongoing litigation related to 9/11 and a previous default judgment that might award some of this money to 9/11 families who lost members of their family in 9/11. So this is, politically speaking, in some ways puts the Biden administration between a rock and a hard place. And the the administration actually requested that they be able to present the courts a statement of interest that expresses the interest of the United States in pending litigation. And the deadline for that is January 28th. If you were advising President Biden and his team today on what that statement of interest should say about these frozen funds, what would you what would you tell him?
Well, I have spoken to senior U.S. officials about this, and I've told them privately what the International Crisis Group has been saying publicly, which is that you need to unfreeze those assets, probably in initial tranches, to make sure you're monitoring for any unintended effects, and bit by bit give that money back to Afghanistan's central bank so it can do its job, so that it can provide central banking services, an essential state function, which would regulate prices, regulate the value of the Afghani, and allow for those critically important import deals that bring food into the country, that bring medicine into the country. And it's really good that you speak to people who are outside of DC, because I have to say, as an outsider, as someone who is not working in DC, the logic of this doesn't fully make sense to me. The United States is tying up central banking reserves that prevent the Afghan economy from functioning normally. Why? I mean, is it that you don't want the economy of Afghanistan to sustain life in the country, to work? It just doesn't make sense to an outsider. I mean, I understand there in America you have, politics that are really sensitive around, the 9/11 families, and sensitive around the Taliban. But, what is America's interest here? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And if it's trying to avoid a messy state collapse in South Asia that destabilizes the region, which I think that's America's interests, then you should pursue those interests. And sometimes that requires making hard decisions. But that's real politics. That's the nature of geopolitics.